The Victoria Lake House story. My daughter-in-law stood in my kitchen holding a power of attorney document with my forged signature, telling the social worker that I was too confused to live alone anymore. I was supposed to be recovering from hip surgery, not fighting for my independence, but there I was, listening from the hallway as they planned my future without me. I'm Dorothy Richardson, and at 68 years old, I thought I had seen every kind of challenge life could throw at me. I was wrong. The events that would change everything began 3 months earlier, in the spring of 2024, when I had fallen in my garden while tending to my prize-winning roses. The fall resulted in a fractured hip that required surgery and several weeks of recovery. What should have been a straightforward healing process became the opening my daughter-in-law, Patricia, had been waiting for. Let me start from the beginning, because understanding how I got to that moment requires knowing the foundation I had built over decades of hard work and careful planning. After my husband Robert passed away 8 years ago from complications related to diabetes, I made a conscious decision to create a life of independence and security. Robert and I had been married for 32 years when he died, and his death at 63 left me not just emotionally devastated, but financially vulnerable. Like many women of my generation, I had trusted him to handle most of our financial affairs, focusing instead on raising our children and managing our household. The wake-up call came when I discovered that Robert's medical bills had depleted much of our savings, and his life insurance policy was smaller than I had believed. Sitting in our financial advisor's office 3 weeks after the funeral, learning that I had perhaps 2 years of expenses covered before I would need to make dramatic changes, I felt a cold fear that I had never experienced before. But that fear, rather than paralyzing me, became a catalyst for the most productive and empowering period of my life. I spent the first year after Robert's death educating myself about finances, investments, and property management. I read every book I could find, attended seminars at the community college, and gradually took control of what assets we did have. By the end of that first year, I had moved from our large family home in the suburbs to a more manageable townhouse, investing the difference in a diversified portfolio that provided steady income. But the real transformation came when I decided to pursue something I had always dreamed of but never had the courage to attempt: opening my own business. I had always been skilled at refinishing and restoring antique furniture, a hobby that had filled our garage for years, with pieces I had rescued from estate sales and flea markets. What if, I wondered, I could turn this passion into income? Victoria's Vintage Restoration opened 2 years after Robert's death, operating out of a small workshop rented in the historic Arts District downtown. What started as a way to supplement my widow's benefits grew into a thriving business that served interior designers, antique dealers, and individual collectors throughout the region. My reputation for meticulous craftsmanship and fair pricing grew steadily, and within 3 years, I was earning more than I had ever made in my life. The success of the business allowed me to make a purchase that became the crown jewel of my independence: a small lake house about an hour north of the city. The property was nothing special when I bought it, a modest 2-bedroom cabin on half an acre with 150 feet of lakefront. But it had good bones and unlimited potential, and I spent the next 3 years slowly transforming it into my personal sanctuary. Every weekend I would drive to the lake house, sometimes to work on the restoration projects for clients in the peaceful setting, but more often to continue improving the property itself. I installed new windows that captured the morning light perfectly, built custom shelving and storage solutions, created a workshop space where I could work on smaller pieces, and established gardens that attracted wildlife while requiring minimal maintenance. The lake house represented everything I had learned about creating security and independence. I owned it outright, having paid cash from the proceeds of selling our family home and my business profits. The property taxes were reasonable, the maintenance costs were manageable, and it provided both a retreat from the demands of running a business and a potential source of rental income if I ever needed it. It was also my planned retirement home. My vision was to sell the townhouse and the business when I turned 70, move to the lake house full-time, and live comfortably on my investments and Social Security. I had even begun the process of slowly reducing my client load, taking on only the most interesting and profitable projects. But Patricia, my son David's wife of 7 years, had different ideas about my future. Patricia Miller Richardson had married my son when she was 28 and he was 31. She was beautiful, ambitious, and came from a family that valued appearances and social status above most other considerations. Her father was a successful surgeon, her mother was active in all the right charitable organizations, and Patricia herself had a master's degree in marketing that she used to build a career in luxury real estate. From the beginning, I sensed that Patricia viewed my modest background and practical approach to life as somewhat embarrassing. She never said anything directly critical, but there were subtle comments about my little business, suggestions that I should dress more appropriately for my age, and a general attitude that implied she was doing the family a favor by tolerating my presence at gatherings. The tension between us became more pronounced after Robert's death, particularly as my business grew and my independence became more apparent. Patricia seemed genuinely puzzled by my decision to start a business rather than simply enjoying retirement. She made frequent comments about how unusual it was for a woman my age to be playing with furniture instead of spending time with her grandchildren or taking up more age-appropriate hobbies like book clubs or volunteer work. But the real source of conflict, I realized later, was that my success and independence disrupted Patricia's narrative about our family dynamics. She had married David expecting to be part of a traditional family structure where the older generation would eventually need care and support from the younger generation, giving her influence and control over family decisions. My refusal to fit that mold, my continued financial independence, and my clear plans for my own future represented a threat to the role she had envisioned for herself. The situation escalated when David and Patricia began having financial difficulties. David worked as a mid-level manager for an insurance company, earning a decent but not exceptional salary. Patricia's real estate career was successful but inconsistent, with income that varied dramatically based on market conditions and seasonal patterns. They had purchased a house that stretched their budget, taken on car loans for vehicles that projected success rather than reflecting their actual financial position, and committed to private school tuition for their 2 children, Emma and Michael. By 2023, their financial stress was becoming apparent to anyone who knew them well. They had begun asking for loans, first small amounts for specific emergencies, then larger sums to help with mortgage payments and tuition. I had helped them several times, viewing it as a grandparent's privilege and responsibility to support her family during difficult periods. But Patricia's requests became increasingly frequent and her justifications less convincing. She began making comments about how unfair it was that I lived alone in both a townhouse and a lake house while they struggled to maintain their single residence. She suggested that I could easily solve their problems by selling one of my properties and helping them with their debt, or by allowing them to use the lake house as a rental property to generate additional income. When I declined these suggestions, explaining that my properties were part of my retirement security and that I needed to maintain my own financial independence, Patricia's attitude toward me shifted noticeably. She became cooler, more critical, and began making pointed comments about my selfishness and lack of concern for my son's family. The situation reached a breaking point in February 2024, when David and Patricia asked to borrow $50,000 to help them avoid foreclosure on their home. The request was accompanied by a detailed explanation of their financial situation that revealed the extent of their debt and poor money management. They owed money on credit cards, car loans, a home equity line of credit, and had fallen behind on their mortgage payments. I agreed to help them, but only under specific conditions. I would pay their overdue mortgage payments directly to the bank, not give them cash. They would need to create and stick to a realistic budget that addressed their spending habits. And they would need to acknowledge that this was a one-time intervention, not the beginning of an ongoing pattern of financial rescue. Patricia was furious with these conditions, viewing them as insulting and controlling. She accused me of treating them like children, of being unwilling to trust my own son, and of caring more about money than family. The conversation ended with her storming out of my townhouse and David following reluctantly after apologizing for her behavior. For several weeks after that confrontation, I had almost no contact with David's family. Patricia refused to speak to me, and David seemed caught between loyalty to his wife and his relationship with his mother. I continued to see my grandchildren occasionally when David brought them to visit without Patricia, but even those visits were strained and awkward. Then, in early April, everything changed when I fell in my garden. I had been working in my rose garden on a beautiful spring Saturday morning, pruning the bushes and preparing them for the growing season. It was work I had done hundreds of times over the years, but this time, as I was reaching for a high branch, I lost my balance and fell backward onto the stone border that edged the garden bed. The pain was immediate and severe, a sharp grinding sensation in my right hip that made it impossible to stand or even change position. I lay there for nearly 20 minutes before my neighbor, Mrs. Chen, happened to see me from her kitchen window and called 911. The emergency room diagnosis was a displaced fracture of the femoral neck, requiring immediate surgery to insert a metal plate and screws. The orthopedic surgeon, Dr. Martinez, explained that the recovery would take several weeks, during which I would need to use a walker, attend physical therapy sessions, and avoid certain movements that could disrupt the healing process. The social worker at the hospital, Ms. Thompson, raised the question that I had been dreading. whether I would be able to manage safely at home during my recovery. My townhouse had stairs to the second floor where my bedroom was located. The bathroom was small and would be difficult to navigate with a walker. I lived alone, had no immediate family nearby except for David and Patricia, and my business required physical work that would be impossible during recovery. When David and Patricia arrived at the hospital the evening after my surgery, they were full of concern and offers to help. Patricia, in particular, seemed to have set aside our recent conflict, speaking warmly about how they would make sure I had everything I needed during my recovery. "Of course you'll stay with us while you heal," Patricia said, taking my hand and speaking in the solicitous tone people use with invalids. "We have that guest room on the first floor, and I can easily help with your physical therapy exercises and make sure you're taking your medications properly." I appreciated their concern, but the idea of staying in their home for several weeks made me uncomfortable. Their house was chaotic with the children's activities, David's work demands, and Patricia's unpredictable schedule. I valued my independence and privacy, and I knew that staying with them would create tensions and obligations that could complicate my recovery. "That's very kind," I said carefully, "but I think I'll be more comfortable recovering at home. I can arrange for a physical therapist to come to the house, and I have neighbors who can check on me and help with errands." Patricia's expression shifted slightly, though she maintained her concerned tone. "Dorothy, I don't think you're being realistic about what recovery from this kind of surgery involves. You'll need help with basic daily activities, transportation to follow-up appointments, assistance with medications. It's not safe for someone your age to be alone during this kind of recovery." The phrase, "someone your age," rankled, as did the implication that I was being unrealistic about my own capabilities. But I was tired, still groggy from anesthesia, and not in a condition to have a detailed discussion about my care options. "Let me think about it, Monsieur," I said. "I need to talk to the doctor about what my options are." Dr. Martinez, when I asked him the next day, confirmed that I would need assistance during the early stages of recovery, but he didn't see any reason why I couldn't return home with appropriate support services. He gave me contact information for a home health agency that could provide both physical therapy and some personal care assistance, and suggested that I might benefit from a temporary stay in a rehabilitation facility if I was concerned about managing at home. But when David and Patricia returned that afternoon, they had already made decisions about my care. "We've cleared out the guest room and set up everything you'll need," Patricia announced, as if the matter had been settled. "David picked up your medications from the pharmacy, and I've scheduled your first physical therapy appointment for Thursday." "I haven't agreed to stay with you," I said, feeling a familiar frustration with Patricia's tendency to make decisions without consulting others. "Mom," David interjected gently, "we're just trying to help. The doctor said you need assistance, and we want to make sure you're safe." "I can arrange for assistance at my own home, I replied. "I don't need to disrupt your household for weeks." Patricia's mask of concern slipped slightly. "Dorothy, you're being stubborn about this. We're offering to take care of you, and you're acting like it's some kind of imposition. What would Robert think about you refusing help from your own family?" The invocation of Robert's name in that context felt manipulative, and I recognized it as a tactic Patricia had used before to pressure me into compliance with her wishes. But I was still weak from surgery, and the prospect of arguing with her while lying in a hospital bed was exhausting. "Fine, Sus," I said finally, "but just until I'm steady on my feet. A week or two at most." Patricia smiled triumphantly. "Of course, just until you're back to normal." I should have recognized that Patricia and I had very different definitions of back to normal. The first week at David and Patricia's house was reasonably pleasant. Patricia was attentive to my needs, helping me navigate the house with my walker, driving me to my physical therapy appointments, and ensuring that I was comfortable in the guest room they had prepared. David was kind and supportive, bringing me books and magazines, setting up a television in my room, and spending time each evening talking about his work and the children's activities. Emma and Michael, my grandchildren, were delighted to have me staying in their house. Emma, who was 12, appointed herself as my special helper, bringing me snacks and drinks and reading to me in the afternoons. Michael, at 10, was fascinated by my walker and the exercises I was supposed to do, often mimicking the movements and asking detailed questions about how bones heal. But by the second week, subtle changes began to appear in Patricia's behavior. She became more directive about my activities, insisting that I rest more than I felt necessary, and discouraging me from doing simple tasks that I was perfectly capable of managing. When I expressed interest in returning to my townhouse, she became concerned and slightly agitated. I really don't think you're ready for that, she said when I mentioned that I was feeling stronger and more confident with the walker. You're still taking pain medication, and you've only had a few physical therapy sessions. What if you fall again? The risk of falling isn't significantly higher at my house than it is here, I replied, and my physical therapist says I'm making good progress. But if something happens here, David and I are available to help immediately. If you're alone at your house and you fall or have a medical emergency, it could be hours before anyone finds you. Her arguments weren't entirely unreasonable, but there was something in her tone that suggested she had reasons beyond my safety for wanting me to stay. When I pressed her about a timeline for my return home, she became vague and evasive. Let's just take it week by week, she said. There's no rush to make decisions about your living situation while you're still recovering. The phrase living situation struck me as odd, since my living situation was clearly established and had nothing to do with my temporary recovery needs, but I attributed her word choice to poor phrasing rather than intentional significance. My suspicions began to develop during the third week of my stay, when I started to notice that Patricia was making decisions about my care and activities without consulting me. She had rescheduled my physical therapy appointments to times that were convenient for her schedule, rather than asking about my preferences. She had called my doctor's office to discuss my progress and medication needs, identifying herself as my primary caregiver. She had even contacted my business clients to inform them that I would be unavailable indefinitely due to health issues. When I asked her about the client calls, she seemed surprised that I was concerned. I was just trying to help manage things while you focus on recovery, she said. I know how much stress you put on yourself about work, and I thought it would be better for your healing if you didn't have to worry about business obligations. But some of those clients have projects with specific deadlines, I said, and I didn't authorize you to speak for me in business matters. Dorothy, you're recovering from major surgery. Your clients will understand that health comes first. And if they don't understand that, maybe they're not the kind of clients you should be working with anyway. The conversation revealed a fundamental misunderstanding about my relationship with my work. Patricia viewed my business as a hobby or diversion that I could easily set aside, while I saw it as an integral part of my identity and financial security. Her casual dismissal of my professional commitments felt disrespectful and presumptuous. But the real turning point came during my fourth week of recovery, when I overheard a phone conversation that Patricia was having in the kitchen while she thought I was napping. No, she's not ready to go back to living alone, as Patricia was saying. She's still unsteady with the walker, and she gets confused about her medications sometimes. I really think she needs ongoing supervision, at least for the next few months. I listened more carefully, realizing that she was speaking to someone in an official capacity, possibly a social worker or insurance representative. Yes, we're definitely willing to continue providing care for her, Patricia continued. David and I have discussed it, and we think the best option might be to make this arrangement permanent. She has a house that's not really suitable for someone with mobility issues, and she's been trying to manage a business that's clearly too much for someone her age. My blood went cold as I understood what I was hearing. Patricia was discussing my future care needs with someone, presenting herself as my primary caregiver, and suggesting that my living situation needed to be permanently changed. She was describing me as confused and unable to manage my own affairs, characteristics that bore no resemblance to my actual condition. We've been thinking that she might benefit from selling her properties and using the proceeds to help with her care costs, Patricia continued. She has this lake house that just sits empty most of the time, and her townhouse has stairs that aren't safe for someone with her limitations. If she sold both properties and moved in with us permanently, she could contribute to the household expenses, and we could make sure she gets the supervision she needs. The conversation continued for several more minutes, with Patricia describing my supposed limitations and needs in terms that made me sound like I was suffering from significant cognitive and physical decline. She mentioned my confusion about medications, my unsafe living environment, and my unrealistic expectations about returning to work. When she finished the call, I lay in the guest room bed, my mind racing with the implications of what I had heard. Patricia wasn't just offering temporary care during my recovery. She was actively working to establish herself as my caregiver and to convince official agencies that I needed ongoing supervision and support. She was describing my condition in ways that could be used to question my competence to make my own decisions about my living situation, my business, and my property. And most alarmingly, she was already planning how my assets could be used to support her family's financial needs. I spent the rest of that day carefully observing Patricia's behavior and listening to her conversations with new awareness. I noticed that she had begun referring to my stay as living with us, rather than recovering with us. She spoke about my future plans in ways that assumed I would be remaining in their house indefinitely, and she made comments about my properties and business as if they were problems that needed to be solved, rather than assets that I owned and controlled. That evening, when David came to check on me before bedtime, I decided to test my growing suspicions. "I'm feeling much stronger," I told him. "I think I'll be ready to go home this weekend." His response was telling. Instead of expressing pleasure at my recovery, he looked uncomfortable and uncertain. "Are you sure you're ready for that, Mom? Patricia thinks you might benefit from staying here a little longer, just to be safe." "What does Patricia think about my recovery that would be different from what my doctor and physical therapist think?" I asked. David shifted uncomfortably. "She's just concerned about you being alone. She's noticed that you sometimes seem confused about things, and she's worried that you might not be taking your medications correctly." "What things have I seemed confused about?" He couldn't provide specific examples, which confirmed my suspicion that Patricia had been feeding him vague concerns rather than documenting actual incidents of confusion or incompetence. "And what makes her think I'm not taking my medications correctly?" Again, he had no specific incidents to cite, just general concerns that Patricia had expressed. The next morning, I called my doctor's office and spoke directly to Dr. Martinez about my recovery progress and my readiness to return home. He reviewed my physical therapy reports and confirmed that I was progressing well ahead of the typical timeline for my type of surgery. He saw no medical reason why I couldn't return to living independently, though he recommended that I continue with outpatient physical therapy for another few weeks. I also called the home health agency that he had recommended and arranged for a visiting nurse to assess my home environment and provide any additional support services I might need during the remainder of my recovery. Armed with professional confirmation that I was ready to return home, I informed David and Patricia that I would be leaving at the end of the week. Patricia's reaction was immediate and intense. "Absolutely not," she said. "You're not thinking clearly about this. You're not ready to be alone, and we're not going to let you put yourself in danger just because you're being stubborn about accepting help." "I'm not being stubborn," I replied calmly. "I'm making an informed decision based on my doctor's assessment and my own understanding of my capabilities." "Your doctor doesn't see you every day," Patricia countered. "He doesn't know that you've been confused about your medications, that you've been unsteady on your feet, that you've been making poor decisions about your activities." "What confusion about medications, Akshay?" I asked. "What poor decisions about activities?" Patricia's response was vague and evasive, describing incidents that I knew had not occurred and limitations that bore no resemblance to my actual condition. "Patricia," I said, my patience finally exhausted, "I am a competent adult who is recovering well from surgery. I appreciate the care you've provided, but I am ready to return to my own home." "I don't think you understand how serious this situation is," Patricia said, her voice taking on a harder edge. "David and I have legal responsibilities as your caregivers. We can't just let you make dangerous decisions because you're too proud to accept help." The phrase "legal responsibilities as your caregivers" stopped me cold. I had never designated them as my caregivers in any legal sense, and I had certainly not given them any authority to make decisions about my living situation or medical care. "What legal responsibilities?" I asked. Patricia hesitated, realizing that she had revealed more than she intended. "Well, we're your family. We have an obligation to make sure you're safe." "That obligation doesn't give you the right to make decisions for me," I said. That evening, while Patricia was at a work event and David was helping the children with homework, I began searching through the documents and papers that had accumulated in the guest room where I had been staying. I was looking for anything that might explain Patricia's assumption that she had legal authority over my care decisions. What I found was much worse than I had imagined. Hidden in a folder with insurance papers and medical documents, I discovered a power of attorney document that bore my signature and Patricia's name as my designated agent. The document gave Patricia broad authority to make decisions about my medical care, financial affairs, and living arrangements in the event that I became unable to make such decisions myself. The problem was that I had never signed such a document. The signature was a reasonable facsimile of my handwriting, but it was not genuine. Someone had forged my signature on a legal document that would give Patricia control over virtually every aspect of my life. I also found notes in Patricia's handwriting that detailed her observations about my supposed cognitive decline and physical limitations. The notes described incidents of confusion, falls, and poor judgment that had never occurred. They painted a picture of a woman who was declining rapidly and needed immediate intervention to ensure her safety. And most disturbing of all, I found a business card for a social worker specializing in elder care assessments, with an appointment scheduled for the following Monday. The appointment was described as an evaluation of my capacity to live independently and my need for ongoing care services. I realized that Patricia had created an elaborate fiction about my condition and was moving systematically to establish legal control over my life and assets. The power of attorney document would give her authority to make decisions for me. The fabricated notes would provide evidence of my incompetence if anyone questioned her authority. And the social worker's evaluation would provide official confirmation of her claims about my need for supervision. The next morning, while Patricia was out running errands, I called a taxi and left David's house without explanation. I went directly to my attorney's office. Margaret Chen had been handling my legal affairs since Robert's death, helping me establish my business, draft my will, and manage property transactions. She was a competent and trustworthy lawyer who specialized in elder law and estate planning, and I knew she would understand the seriousness of what I had discovered. When I showed her the forged power of attorney document, her reaction was immediate and strong. "This is a serious felony," she said, examining the document carefully. "Forging someone's signature on a power of attorney is a crime that carries significant penalties, including potential prison time." She also reviewed the notes that Patricia had made about my condition and the appointment card for the social worker evaluation. "It appears that someone is building a case to have you declared incompetent," Margaret said. "The forged power of attorney, the fabricated evidence of cognitive decline, the professional evaluation, these are all elements of a systematic effort to gain control over your legal and financial affairs." "What can I do to protect myself?" I asked. Margaret outlined several immediate steps. First, we would file a police report about the forged power of attorney document. Second, we would prepare and file legal documents that explicitly revoked any power of attorney that I had not personally executed with proper witnesses and notarization. Third, we would arrange for an independent medical and psychological evaluation to document my actual mental and physical condition. And finally, we would obtain a restraining order to prevent Patricia from claiming authority over my affairs or interfering with my independence. "This is going to be a difficult process," Margaret warned. "Family members who attempt this kind of manipulation often escalate their behavior when they're confronted. You need to be prepared for the possibility that Patricia will claim you're having a mental health crisis, that you're being influenced by others, or that you're making decisions that demonstrate your incompetence." I returned to David's house that afternoon to collect my belongings and inform them of my plans. Patricia was waiting for me in the living room, her expression a mixture of anger and panic. "Where have you been?" she demanded. "You can't just leave without telling anyone. What if something had happened to you?" "I went to see my attorney," I said calmly. "I needed to discuss some legal matters related to my recovery and care needs." Patricia's face went pale. "What kind of legal matters?" "I discovered that someone has been forging my signature on legal documents," I said, watching her reaction carefully. "Someone has been creating false records about my mental condition, and someone has been scheduling evaluations and appointments without my knowledge or consent." Patricia tried to maintain her composure, but I could see the panic in her eyes. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said. "You've been confused about a lot of things lately. Maybe you should sit down and let me call Dr. Martinez to discuss your concerns." "I'm not confused, Patricia. I found the forged power of attorney document. I found your notes describing incidents that never happened. I found the appointment card for the social worker evaluation that you scheduled without my permission." David appeared in the doorway, clearly having heard at least part of our conversation. His expression was confused and distressed. "Mom, what's going on?" he asked. "Your wife has been forging legal documents in an attempt to gain control over my affairs," I said. "She's been creating false evidence to support a claim that I'm mentally incompetent, and she's been scheduling professional evaluations to confirm her fabricated assessment of my condition." David looked at Patricia, his expression seeking an explanation. "She's having some kind of breakdown," Patricia said quickly. "She's been paranoid and confused for days. I think the medications are affecting her thinking." "David," I said, maintaining eye contact with my son, "I am not having a breakdown. I am not confused. I am not paranoid. I am confronting evidence that your wife has committed serious crimes in an attempt to steal my independence and control my assets." I showed him copies of the documents I had found, explaining the significance of each piece of evidence. I watched as understanding dawned in his face, followed by horror and disbelief. "Patricia," he said, his voice strained, Please tell me this isn't what it looks like. Patricia's mask finally slipped completely. Everything I did was to protect her, she said desperately. She's not capable of taking care of herself anymore. She's going to hurt herself living alone, and she's going to lose everything she's worked for because she's too stubborn to accept help. So you decided to take control of her life without her consent? David asked, his voice rising. I decided to do what was necessary to keep her safe and preserve her assets for the family, Patricia shot back. She's being selfish and unrealistic about her limitations, and someone has to make responsible decisions. The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, with Patricia alternating between denying the evidence and justifying her actions. David grew increasingly upset as the full scope of her deception became clear. But throughout the argument, Patricia maintained that her motivations had been protective rather than exploitative. I gathered my belongings and prepared to leave, informing them that I would be returning to my townhouse and resuming my independent life. I also informed them that Margaret would be contacting them about the legal ramifications of Patricia's actions. Mom, please don't do this, David pleaded. Let's try to work this out as a family. Patricia made mistakes, but she wasn't trying to hurt you. David, I said gently, your wife forged my signature on legal documents and created false evidence to support a plan to have me declared incompetent. These aren't mistakes. These are serious crimes that could have resulted in the loss of my independence, my property, and my fundamental rights as an adult. But your family, he said, tears in his eyes. There has to be a way to resolve this without involving lawyers and police. The time for family resolution passed when Patricia decided to commit fraud instead of having honest conversations about her concerns, I replied. I won't pretend that criminal behavior is acceptable just because it comes from family members. As I left their house for what I suspected might be the last time, I felt a complex mixture of relief, sadness, and determination. Relief that I had discovered and stopped Patricia's scheme before it succeeded. Sadness that my relationship with David and my grandchildren would likely be permanently damaged. And determination to protect myself and others from similar exploitation. The next several weeks were a whirlwind of legal and practical activities. Margaret filed the police report and initiated the process of obtaining protective orders. The district attorney's office opened an investigation into the forged power of attorney document. I underwent comprehensive medical and psychological evaluations that confirmed my mental and physical competence, and I hired a private security consultant to assess and improve the safety features of my townhouse. Patricia, faced with the possibility of serious criminal charges, hired her own attorney and began a campaign to discredit my accusations. Her lawyer argued that she had acted out of genuine concern for my welfare, that she had never intended to use the power of attorney document inappropriately, and that my accusations were evidence of paranoid thinking that confirmed her concerns about my mental state. The battle lasted nearly 6 months, during which Patricia and her attorney used every possible tactic to avoid accountability. They questioned my mental competence despite the professional evaluations that confirmed my full capacity. They claimed that David had participated in creating the documents, hoping to shift responsibility away from Patricia. They argued that the documents were drafts that had never been intended for actual use. But the evidence was overwhelming, and Patricia's shifting explanations only undermined her credibility. The handwriting analysis confirmed that she had forged my signature. The timeline of her actions showed a systematic pattern of deception rather than spontaneous concern, and her own notes revealed that she had been planning to use the fraudulent documents to gain control over my assets. In January 2025, Patricia accepted a plea agreement that included a felony conviction for forgery, 3 years of probation, restitution for my legal expenses, and a permanent restraining order prohibiting her from any involvement in my legal or financial affairs. The conviction also resulted in the suspension of her real estate license, effectively ending her career in that field. David struggled throughout the legal process, caught between loyalty to his wife and recognition of what she had done. Eventually, he chose to support Patricia despite the evidence against her, arguing that the legal consequences were disproportionate to her intentions. This decision effectively ended our relationship, as I could not maintain a close connection with someone who minimized such serious violations of my autonomy and rights. The collateral damage to my relationship with Emma and Michael was the most painful aspect of the entire experience. Patricia convinced them that I was being vindictive and cruel, refusing to forgive honest mistakes and prioritizing legal technicalities over family bonds. David, supporting his wife's narrative, did not encourage the children to maintain independent relationships with me, but the experience also led to unexpected positive developments. Margaret introduced me to other seniors who had faced similar exploitation attempts, and together we formed a support group that eventually evolved into an advocacy organization. We began offering educational workshops about elder abuse, legal rights, and self-protection strategies. My business, rather than suffering from the interruption caused by my surgery and the legal battle, actually grew stronger as word spread about my experience and my refusal to be victimized. Clients appreciated working with someone who demonstrated such clear strength and independence, and my reputation for integrity and competence attracted new customers. The story of how I had protected myself from exploitation resonated particularly with other older women who had faced similar pressures from family members. Several became clients specifically because they admired my willingness to stand up for myself, and they wanted to support a business owner who exemplified the independence they were striving to maintain in their own lives. One client, Margaret Steinberg, a 74-year-old retired professor, hired me to restore a family dining set that had belonged to her grandmother. During our initial consultation, she shared that her adult children had been pressuring her to sell her house and move into assisted living, despite her excellent health and sharp mind. "They keep saying it's for my own good," Margaret told me as we examined the intricate wood inlay on her grandmother's table. "But I've noticed they've already started discussing how to divide up the proceeds from selling my house. They talk about it right in front of me, as if I'm not capable of understanding what they're planning." I shared some of my experience with her, not as advice, but as validation that her instincts about protecting her autonomy were valid and important. Margaret eventually consulted with Margaret Chen, my attorney, and successfully established clear legal boundaries with her children that preserved her independence while addressing their genuine concerns about emergency planning. These conversations with clients led me to understand that my experience with Patricia was not unique or even unusual. Elder financial abuse by family members was far more common than I had realized, and it often followed similar patterns: expressions of concern about safety or capacity, gradual assumption of decision-making authority, and eventual control over assets and living arrangements. The support group that Margaret Chen had connected me with evolved into something much more substantial than we had originally envisioned. What started as monthly meetings of 6 or 7 seniors who had faced exploitation attempts grew into a formal organization that we called the Senior Independence Alliance. By the spring of 2025, we were offering regular educational workshops at community centers, libraries, and senior housing facilities throughout the region. Our topics included recognizing the warning signs of financial exploitation, understanding legal documents like powers of attorney and advance directives, maintaining financial independence while aging, and accessing resources for help when exploitation occurs. I found that sharing my story publicly, while initially uncomfortable, became increasingly empowering. Each time I spoke to a group about Patricia's scheme and how I had protected myself, I saw recognition in the faces of audience members who were facing similar situations. The questions they asked revealed the depth and prevalence of the problem. "My son keeps telling me I should add his name to my bank accounts, just in case something happens to me," one woman shared during a workshop. "He says it will make things easier if I become incapacitated, but I've heard stories about children who empty their parents' accounts. How do I know if his intentions are genuinely protective or if he's planning to use my money for his own purposes?" Another workshop participant asked, "My daughter-in-law has started making comments about how dangerous it is for me to live alone, and she's suggested that I should move in with their family. But I like my independence and I can afford to hire help if I need it. How do I address her concerns without giving up my autonomy?" These questions demonstrated that many seniors were caught between legitimate desires to plan for potential future needs and concerns about family members who might be positioning themselves to assume control prematurely or inappropriately. Working with Margaret Chen, we developed practical tools and resources that address these common dilemmas. We created checklists for evaluating whether family concerns about independence were genuine or manipulative. We developed template language for legal documents that protected seniors' autonomy while addressing family members' legitimate needs for emergency planning. And we established relationships with social workers, financial planners, and healthcare providers who understood the importance of preserving senior independence whenever possible. The most rewarding aspect of this work was witnessing the transformation that occurred when seniors realized they had rights, resources, and support systems available to them. I watched as workshop participants went from feeling helpless and isolated to feeling empowered and connected to a community of peers who understood their experiences. One particularly memorable success story involved a 69-year-old widow named Helen Rodriguez, who attended one of our workshops after her son had begun pressuring her to sell her house and move into a senior living facility. Helen was in excellent health, but her son argued that maintaining a house was too much responsibility for someone her age, and that she would be safer and happier in a facility with built-in social activities and medical support. During the workshop, Helen learned about her right to make her own living arrangements as long as she was competent, and about resources available to help seniors age in place safely and comfortably. She also learned about the financial red flags that might indicate a family member's motivations were not entirely altruistic, such as discussions about inheritance, assumptions about asset management, and pressure to make immediate decisions about long-term care. Helen's son had been making all of these concerning statements, and she realized that his urgency about her living situation might be motivated more by his financial needs than by her safety requirements. She consulted with Margaret Chen, established clear legal documentation of her wishes, and hired a care coordinator to help her age in place safely. 6 months later, she was thriving in her own home with appropriate support services, and her son had stopped pressuring her about moving. The Senior Independence Alliance also began working on larger systemic issues that contributed to elder exploitation. We discovered that many professionals who worked with seniors, including doctors, social workers, and financial advisors, had not received training about recognizing and preventing elder abuse. We developed educational programs for these professionals, helping them understand their roles in protecting senior autonomy while addressing legitimate safety concerns. We also worked with local law enforcement agencies to improve their responses to elder abuse cases. Many officers had not received specific training about the legal and practical aspects of elder exploitation, and they sometimes dismissed cases as family disputes, rather than recognizing them as serious crimes. Our advocacy helped establish specialized training programs and designated elder abuse investigators in several police departments. Perhaps most importantly, we worked to change cultural attitudes about aging and independence. We challenged the assumption that reaching a certain age automatically meant becoming dependent or incompetent. We promoted the understanding that aging might require adaptations and support services, but that it did not necessarily require surrendering autonomy or decision-making authority. This work connected me with a broader movement of older adults who were redefining what it meant to age successfully. We were not just trying to maintain the status quo or resist necessary changes. We were advocating for aging with dignity, choice, and self-determination. My own life evolved in ways I had not anticipated when I first fought Patricia's exploitation attempt. The lake house, which had been intended as my retirement retreat, became the headquarters for much of our advocacy work. I hosted planning meetings, strategy sessions, and informal gatherings for seniors who needed support and encouragement. The property's peaceful setting and comfortable accommodations made it an ideal place for people to discuss difficult family situations and explore options for protecting themselves. Many of our most productive conversations happened on the deck overlooking the lake, where the natural beauty provided a calming backdrop for addressing challenging topics. My business also evolved to incorporate my advocacy work more directly. I began offering specialized services for seniors who were downsizing their homes or dealing with family pressure to dispose of valuable possessions. I understood the emotional significance of family heirlooms and personal treasures, and I could help clients make thoughtful decisions about what to keep, what to pass on to family members, and what to sell or donate. This work often involved helping seniors navigate family dynamics around inheritance and asset management. I had learned to recognize the signs of family members who were pressuring seniors to give up valuable items prematurely, and I could provide both practical support and emotional validation for seniors who wanted to maintain control over their possessions. One client, James Morrison, hired me to help him organize and catalog his extensive collection of vintage tools, many of which had belonged to his father and grandfather. James's adult children had been urging him to get rid of the tools, arguing that they were taking up too much space in his garage and that he was too old to use them safely. But James was still an active woodworker who used the tools regularly for projects around his house and gifts for his grandchildren. The tools were also an important connection to his family history and his identity as a craftsman. Rather than pressuring him to dispose of the collection, I helped him organize the tools more efficiently, identify which ones were most valuable and meaningful to him, and create a plan for eventually passing them on to family members who would appreciate their significance. The process took several months, during which James and I had many conversations about family relationships, personal values, and the importance of maintaining connections to one's heritage and interests. By the end of the project, James had retained the tools that were most important to him, gifted a few special pieces to grandchildren who were showing interest in woodworking, and created a detailed inventory with historical information that would help his family understand the significance of the collection after his death. James's children, initially frustrated by his stubborn attachment to the tools, came to understand that their father's workshop was an essential part of his identity and well-being. They learned to appreciate the skill and knowledge he demonstrated through his continued woodworking, and they began bringing their own children to learn from their grandfather's expertise. These experiences reinforced my understanding that aging successfully was not about giving up meaningful activities or possessions, but about adapting and planning thoughtfully for changing needs and circumstances. When seniors were supported in making their own decisions about these adaptations, they were more likely to maintain their sense of identity, purpose, and autonomy. By the summer of 2025, 18 months after Patricia's criminal conviction, I had built a life that was richer and more purposeful than anything I had imagined before her betrayal attempt. My business was thriving, my advocacy work was making a real difference in the lives of other seniors, and I had developed a network of meaningful relationships with people who shared my values and experiences. The lake house had become a gathering place for friends and colleagues who were working on similar issues. I hosted regular dinners for other advocates, planning retreats for the Senior Independence Alliance, and informal support groups for seniors who were dealing with family exploitation attempts. One evening in late July, as I was preparing dinner for a group of advocacy colleagues, I reflected on how dramatically my life had changed since that moment when I overheard Patricia planning my future without my consent. Her attempt to control my life had ultimately led me to discover capabilities and purposes I hadn't known I possessed. Margaret Chen, who had become not just my attorney but a close friend, arrived early to help with dinner preparations. As we worked together in the kitchen, she shared an observation that had occurred to her recently. "You know," she said, "Patricia's scheme failed for one crucial reason that she never understood. She assumed that you were vulnerable because you were aging, but she completely misunderstood what vulnerability actually looks like in older adults." I looked up from the salad I was preparing, curious about her insight. "Real vulnerability in seniors," Margaret continued, "comes from isolation, lack of information, and absence of support systems. You had none of those vulnerabilities. You had strong professional relationships, clear financial understanding, good health, and the knowledge to seek help when you needed it. Patricia saw your age as a weakness, but your age was actually a source of strength because it represented decades of experience, learning, and relationship building." Her observation resonated deeply with me. Patricia had indeed misunderstood the nature of aging and vulnerability. She had assumed that reaching a certain chronological age automatically meant becoming dependent and incompetent, but she had failed to recognize the accumulated wisdom, resources, and resilience that many older adults possessed. "That's exactly what we're trying to help other seniors understand," I said. "Age is not synonymous with vulnerability. Vulnerability comes from specific circumstances that can often be addressed or prevented regardless of age." Our dinner guests began arriving shortly afterward. Other members of the Senior Independence Alliance Board, a social worker who specialized in elder abuse prevention, a financial planner who donated time to our educational workshops, and a retired judge who had handled many elder abuse cases during her career. As we sat on the deck overlooking the lake, sharing a meal and discussing our ongoing projects, I felt a profound sense of gratitude for the community I had found and the work we were doing together. Patricia's betrayal had been painful and frightening, but it had also opened a door to a life that was more connected, purposeful, and impactful than anything I had experienced before. Judge Sarah Mitchell, who had retired the previous year after 30 years on the bench, raised her wineglass in a toast. "To Dorothy, Yaman, she said, who showed us all that the best response to attempted exploitation is not just personal protection, but community empowerment." As our guests raised their glasses in response, I thought about Patricia and David, and about Emma and Michael, whom I had not seen in over a year. The sadness of those lost relationships would always be part of my story, but it no longer defined my daily experience or limited my future possibilities. Patricia had served her probation without incident and had eventually found work in a different field, though I heard through occasional updates that her marriage to David remained strained. David had never contacted me directly since the legal proceedings ended, though Margaret had told me that he had inquired through his own attorney about the possibility of reconciliation. I was not opposed to rebuilding some kind of relationship with David, but it would require his acknowledgement of what had occurred and his commitment to ensuring that nothing similar could happen again. As long as he remained married to Patricia and continued to minimize her actions, such a reconciliation seemed unlikely. The loss of regular contact with Emma and Michael was more painful, but I held on to hope that as they grew older and developed their own understanding of family relationships, they might seek to reconnect with me independently. I had established trust funds for their education, managed by Margaret Chen, to ensure that they would have resources available regardless of their parents' financial situation. As the evening wound down and our guests prepared to leave, Margaret approached me with a proposal that would open an entirely new chapter in my advocacy work. I've been contacted by a publisher, she said, who is interested in having you write a book about your experience and the work we've been doing with the Senior Independence Alliance. They want something that combines personal narrative with practical guidance for other seniors who might be facing similar situations. The idea intrigued me, though I was initially uncertain about sharing such personal details with a broader audience. The publisher specifically mentioned that they want the book to be empowering rather than frightening, Margaret continued. They want seniors to understand that they have more power and resources than they might realize, and that exploitation attempts can be prevented and defeated. I agreed to consider the proposal, and over the following weeks, I found myself thinking about what kind of book might be most helpful to other seniors in vulnerable situations. I realized that my story could serve as both a cautionary tale about the warning signs of family exploitation and an encouraging example of successful self-protection. Working with a professional writer, I began developing a book that would combine my personal experience with practical guidance about legal rights, financial protection, and family communication strategies. The book would also include stories from other members of the Senior Independence Alliance, providing readers with multiple examples of successful advocacy and self-protection. The writing process was challenging in unexpected ways. Revisiting the details of Patricia's betrayal and the painful rupture in my family relationships required me to process emotions and memories that I had not fully examined since the immediate aftermath of the crisis. But it also provided an opportunity to reflect on how much I had grown and changed as a result of the experience. One section of the book that proved particularly important was a chapter about forgiveness and family relationships. Many readers, I realized, would be struggling with the same conflicts I had faced about whether to prioritize family harmony or personal protection. I wanted to provide guidance that honored both values while making clear that personal safety and autonomy could not be sacrificed for the sake of maintaining relationships with people who were unwilling to respect basic boundaries. I wrote about the difference between forgiveness as an internal process of releasing anger and resentment, and reconciliation as an external process of rebuilding trust and relationship. Forgiveness, I argued, was something I could pursue for my own emotional well-being, but reconciliation required acknowledgement, accountability, and behavior change from the other parties involved. Another important section addressed the practical steps that seniors could take to protect themselves from exploitation without becoming isolated or suspicious of all family members. I emphasized the importance of maintaining multiple relationships and information sources, staying informed about legal and financial matters, and creating systems of checks and balances that would prevent any single person from gaining too much control over their affairs. The book also included detailed information about legal protections, warning signs of exploitation, and resources for help. Margaret Chen contributed a chapter about elder law and legal protections, while other members of our alliance provided expertise on financial planning, healthcare advocacy, and family communication. When the book was published in the fall of 2025, the response exceeded our expectations. We received letters and emails from seniors throughout the country who had read the book and used its guidance to protect themselves from exploitation attempts or to escape situations where exploitation was already occurring. One letter that particularly moved me came from a 71-year-old woman in Oregon whose son had been systematically depleting her bank accounts through online access he had gained during a brief illness. After reading the book, she had consulted with an elder law attorney, discovered the extent of the theft, and successfully recovered most of her stolen funds through legal action. "Your story gave me the courage to believe that I wasn't being paranoid or ungrateful," she wrote. "It helped me understand that protecting myself was not the same as rejecting my family, and that I had both the right and the ability to take action." Another reader, a 66-year-old man in Texas, wrote about how the book had helped him recognize that his daughter's insistence on managing his finances was not appropriate, despite her claims that she was protecting him from scams and poor decisions. He had established new boundaries while maintaining their relationship, and both he and his daughter had ultimately benefited from the clearer expectations and improved communication. The book's success led to speaking opportunities at conferences, workshops, and media interviews that allowed me to reach even broader audiences with the message of senior empowerment and self-protection. I appeared on radio shows, television programs, and podcasts, always emphasizing that aging did not require surrendering autonomy, and that seniors had more power and resources than they often realized. One television interview that generated significant response occurred on a national morning show in early 2026. The host asked me about the most important message I wanted to convey to seniors who might be facing family pressure about their independence. "I want them to understand that they have the right to make their own decisions about their lives, their property, and their care, as long as they are competent to do so," I said. "Age alone does not disqualify anyone from self-determination. If family members have genuine concerns about safety or capacity, there are appropriate ways to address those concerns that respect the senior's autonomy and dignity. The host followed up by asking what advice I would give to adult children who were genuinely concerned about an aging parent's welfare. Have honest, respectful conversations, I replied. Ask questions instead of making assumptions. Involve the parent in planning and decision-making instead of making plans for them. And remember that your parent's willingness to take reasonable risks in order to maintain independence is not the same as your parent being incapable of making good decisions. After the interview aired, I received hundreds of emails and letters from both seniors and adult children who were dealing with these complex family dynamics. Many expressed gratitude for the perspective I had provided, but others revealed the depth of the cultural assumptions about aging that contributed to elder exploitation. Several adult children wrote to argue that I was encouraging seniors to be stubborn and unrealistic about their limitations. They felt that my emphasis on senior autonomy was dangerous and could lead to preventable accidents or poor decisions. These responses helped me understand that changing attitudes about aging and independence required education for families across generational lines, not just for seniors themselves. Working with the Senior Independence Alliance, I began developing educational programs for adult children and other family members of aging relatives. These programs emphasize the importance of respecting senior autonomy while addressing legitimate safety concerns, and they provided practical guidance for family communication and collaborative planning. One workshop exercise that proved particularly effective involved role-playing scenarios where adult children practiced having conversations with their aging parents about safety concerns without assuming decision-making authority. Participants learned to ask questions like, "What are your thoughts about adapting your home for easier navigation?" instead of making statements like, "You need to install grab bars in your bathroom." The difference in language and approach seemed small, but it reflected a fundamental shift from paternalistic control to collaborative problem-solving that preserved the senior's dignity and autonomy while still addressing practical concerns. By 2026, 3 years after Patricia's betrayal attempt, I had built a life and career that felt more meaningful and impactful than anything I had achieved before that crisis. The Senior Independence Alliance had grown into a regional organization with chapters in 6 states, providing education, advocacy, and support services to thousands of older adults. My book had become a standard resource for elder law attorneys, social workers, and senior service organizations throughout the country. But perhaps most importantly, I had discovered that my response to exploitation could serve as a model for other seniors who found themselves in similar situations. Rather than accepting victimization or retreating into isolation, I had chosen to fight back, protect myself, and transform my experience into resources for others. The lake house, where I now lived full-time, had become a symbol of successful aging and independence. It hosted regular gatherings of advocates, served as a retreat center for seniors dealing with family conflicts, and provided a peaceful setting for the writing and planning work that had become central to my life. On quiet evenings, when I sat on the deck watching the sunset over the water, I sometimes thought about the conversation I had overheard that day in Patricia's kitchen, when she was planning my future without my knowledge or consent. That moment of violation and betrayal had been the catalyst for everything that followed. The legal battle, the advocacy work, the book, the speaking engagements, and the community of remarkable people who had become central to my life. Patricia had intended to diminish my autonomy and control my assets, but her actions had ultimately led me to discover capabilities and purposes I had never known I possessed. In trying to make me smaller and more dependent, she had inadvertently pushed me to become larger and more influential than I had ever been before. I would never be grateful for her betrayal, and the loss of my relationship with David and my grandchildren would always be a source of sadness. But I was profoundly grateful for what I had learned about myself, about aging, and about the power of community in protecting and empowering vulnerable people. As I prepared for sleep each night in the home I had chosen and designed for myself, I felt the deep satisfaction that comes from knowing that my life had meaning and impact beyond my personal comfort and security. Patricia's scheme had failed not just because I had protected myself, but because I had transformed my protection into a platform for helping others protect themselves. And in that transformation, I had discovered that successful aging was not about avoiding all risks or accepting all limitations, but about making thoughtful choices, maintaining meaningful relationships, and continuing to grow and contribute regardless of chronological age. The lake house that had been intended as my retirement retreat had become instead the headquarters for a movement that was changing how society thought about aging, independence, and family relationships. Every workshop we conducted, every senior we helped protect themselves, every family we taught to communicate more respectfully, represented a victory against the assumptions and attitudes that made exploitation possible. In fighting for my own autonomy, I had helped create a world where other seniors would be less likely to face the betrayal and exploitation that had nearly destroyed my independence. That legacy felt more valuable than any property or asset that Patricia could have tried to steal.